At first glance, it looks ordinary. Another arms deal, another headline, another African military is spending big money. But look closer, and the details don't line up the way they usually do. The loud weapons aren't the focus. The money isn't flowing where it normally flows. And the most important part of the agreement isn't even meant to be seen by the public. This deal didn't chase headlines. It avoided them. There were no speeches about security partnerships, no talk of defending democracy, no moral packaging, just contracts, production plans, and quiet coordination. The kind that doesn't try to impress you today, but reshapes leverage tomorrow. What makes this unsettling is not how much was spent, but what was prioritized, what was deliberately delayed, and what was clearly planned for later. Because this isn't about buying weapons. It's about deciding who controls survival when war stops being short and help stops coming. So what exactly was hidden inside this deal? Let's find out. The first thing Egypt asked for wasn't dramatic. No jets screaming across runways, no tanks rolling through deserts, no hardware that looks good on national television. It asked for something far quieter and far more revealing. Short-range air defense. Specifically, a system designed to track, lock onto, and eliminate drones and low-flying aerial threats. That choice alone tells you how seriously Egypt has been watching modern wars unfold. Because the last decade has made one thing painfully clear. Armies don't collapse when their biggest weapons are destroyed. They collapse when they're constantly watched, constantly harassed, and slowly drained. Drones don't win wars in a single strike. They do something more dangerous. They erase safety, they expose movement, they force armies to hide, slow down, and burn resources just to exist. Once drones dominate the sky, every truck becomes a target. Every base leaks information. Every delay costs lives. Egypt didn't want dominance. It wanted airspace silence. That's why the Tolga short-range air defense system sits at the front of this deal. It's not glamorous. It doesn't change borders. It simply removes a modern nightmare. Being hunted cheaply, endlessly, and invisibly. This is the kind of weapon you buy when you're done reacting and ready to stabilize. But here's the part that matters more than the system itself. Egypt treated air defense as a temporary fix, not a solution. Buying protection was step one. It wasn't the destination. That's because Egypt understands something many countries learn too late. Controlling the sky doesn't end wars. It only delays collapse. What actually decides outcomes happens after the first shock, after the first wave, after the world stops paying attention. That's when conflicts become boring, brutal, and expensive. And that's when the real weakness of most African militaries shows up. Not in courage, not in numbers, not in training, in continuity. Air defense systems don't consume much. Ammunition does, every day, every hour, in quantities that don't make headlines. Shells fired and forgotten, rounds burned through without ceremony. Supply chains stretched until someone, somewhere decides to pause. Egypt saw this pattern clearly. Fix the sky first, yes, but then immediately move to what actually determines whether an army can keep fighting when allies hesitate, and suppliers slow down. That's why, almost immediately after securing air defense, Egypt pushed the conversation away from weapons and towards something far less visible. Factories, production lines, output. And that pivot raises a question that changes the meaning of the entire deal. If air defense keeps you alive today, what did Egypt decide it needed to survive the long war that comes after? Because once the sky is quiet, the real problem begins. Wars don't end when drones are neutralized. They slow down, they stretch, they turn into something far less dramatic and far more dangerous: endurance contests. This is where most militaries fail, not in battle, but in time. Egypt knows this from history, not theory. After the first month of a serious conflict, attention fades. Headlines move on. Allies start calculating costs. Emergency shipments become negotiations. And that's when armies discover whether their strength is real or rented. This is why Egypt didn't treat air defense as the core of the deal. It treated it as a prerequisite. a way to stop bleeding long enough to address the actual choke point of modern warfare: ammunition. Ammunition is boring. It doesn't trend. It doesn't intimidate on camera. But it decides everything. Artillery shells disappear by the thousands. Infantry rounds vanish daily. Heavy caliber ammunition drains faster than public estimates ever admit. And once supply tightens, tactics shrink. Movement slows. Commanders become cautious. Momentum dies, not because the enemy is stronger, but because logistics are weaker. For decades, African militaries lived with this vulnerability. They imported nearly everything they consumed. That meant timelines weren't theirs, prices weren't theirs, and in moments of pressure, access wasn't guaranteed. Egypt decided that was unacceptable. That's why the center of gravity in this deal shifted away from weapons and toward production capacity. Not stockpiles, which can be depleted. Not emergency contracts, which can be delayed. But factories, assets that work every day regardless of politics. A full-scale 155mm artillery ammunition facility. Dedicated production lines for standard infantry and heavy machine gun calibers. Continuous output. Predictable supply. Controlled domestically. This wasn't about preparing for a specific war. It was about eliminating a structural weakness that appears in every prolonged conflict. Because once ammunition becomes scarce, power evaporates quietly. No defeat announcement, no surrender, just fewer options, shorter engagements, and eventual concessions. Egypt wasn't interested in fighting bravely and running out later. It wanted to remove running out as a possibility. But here's where the story becomes uncomfortable for anyone still thinking defensively. Egypt didn't design this capacity as if it were the only consumer. The scale didn't match simple self-sufficiency. The infrastructure wasn't minimal. The planning went beyond domestic needs. Which means this move wasn't just about keeping Egypt supplied. It was about what happens after Egypt is secure. So the real question becomes unavoidable. Who else was Egypt planning to supply once its own lines were running? Because the moment production exists, isolation stops making sense. Once Egypt committed to building real ammunition capacity, a quiet decision followed. One that wasn't framed as political, but absolutely was. The factories were not designed as sealed national assets. They were designed to move output outward. That's where the joint venture enters the picture. This wasn't a side clause. It wasn't administrative fluff. The creation of a shared production and export company signaled intent. Egypt was not just solving a domestic weakness. It was positioning itself inside a regional vacuum that had existed for decades. Across Africa, military supply is fragile by default. Even countries with stable armies depend on long supply routes, foreign approvals, and shifting diplomatic moods. When tensions rise, deliveries slow. When politics change, contracts stall. Everyone knows this, and everyone works around it until they can't. Egypt saw that gap clearly. A nearby, consistent producer changes behavior without saying a word. States stop over-ordering just in case. They stop paying premiums for urgency. They stop waiting months for paperwork to clear oceans away. Reliability becomes the product. And reliability creates gravity. Once smaller or mid-sized states realize there is a producer close enough to deliver without drama, demand doesn't need marketing. It appears naturally, not because of ideology, but because militaries hate uncertainty more than anything else. This is where Egypt's role quietly transforms. It's no longer just a consumer protecting itself from future shortages. It becomes a reference point, a place others look to when they want a supply without leverage attached. A node that shifts dependence sideways instead of upward. That's a dangerous change for an old system built on distance and delay. Because influence has always flowed through scarcity. Whoever controls supply controls timing. Whoever controls timing controls outcomes. Egypt's move cuts directly into that chain, not by confrontation, but by presence. And here's the part most people miss. Egypt didn't announce this role. It didn't declare leadership. It didn't invite attention. It lets infrastructure speak. That restraint matters. Loud power invites resistance. Quiet power attracts alignment. But none of this could have happened if political barriers hadn't already fallen. You don't share production and export authority with someone you don't trust to stay aligned under pressure. Which means this story isn't just industrial, it's relational. A decade ago, cooperation at this level would have been unthinkable. Too much tension, too much history, too much distrust. Yet here they were, structuring shared control over something as sensitive as military output. So the next question becomes unavoidable. What changed between these two countries that made this level of trust suddenly possible? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. What changed was not trust, it was a necessity. Turkey and Egypt didn't wake up one morning and forgive each other. There was no emotional reset, no ideological convergence, no public reconciliation tour. What happened instead was far more practical. The environment around them became hostile enough that old grudges stopped being useful. For years, their rivalry was manageable. Disagreements stayed diplomatic. Tensions stayed rhetorical. Each side could afford to wait for the other to come out. But the region stopped cooperating with that patience. Sudan fractured into open conflict. Somalia remained unstable. The Red Sea shifted from trade corridor to security flashpoint. Drones spread faster than any treaty could regulate. Supply chains themselves became tools of pressure, not neutral logistics. In that environment, ideology became a liability. Turkey had already learned a hard lesson earlier than most. Dependence is fragile. After facing restrictions and delays from traditional suppliers, Ankara spent years forcing its defense industry inward, learning, copying, adapting, and eventually exporting. That experience mattered more than its politics. Egypt was watching closely. Cairo didn't need Turkey's worldview, it needed Turkey's path, a proven way to move from buyer to producer without collapsing readiness in the process. And Turkey didn't need Egypt's approval, it needed scale, workforce depth, and access to a region where demand was growing quietly but relentlessly. This is how pragmatic alliances form, not around shared values, but shared exposure. Neither side had the luxury of pretending the old order still worked. Foreign suppliers had become unpredictable. Global crises were stacking. Wars were lasting longer. And every delay now carries operational consequences. So they stopped arguing about the past and started designing around the future. What makes this alignment different is its structure. It wasn't built around mutual defense pledges or political symbolism. It was built around shared risk. Factories don't lie. Production timelines don't bend to speeches. If cooperation fails, both sides lose materially. That kind of arrangement filters out posturing very quickly. By committing to joint production and export, both countries lock themselves into a relationship that only works if stability is maintained. That's not diplomacy, that's interdependence. And that's exactly why this cooperation moved faster than anyone expected. There was no need to convince populations or allies. The incentives were self-enforcing. Egypt got a route out of long-term dependency. Turkey extended its defense footprint into Africa without military entanglement. No one had to pretend this was about friendship. But once this alignment was in place, Egypt didn't just copy Turkey's past, it refined it. It didn't choose a single new patron. It didn't pivot from one dependency to another. Instead, it embedded this deal into a much larger pattern, which raises the next question. What kind of strategy avoids dependency altogether, rather than just changing who you depend on? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The mistake most people make is assuming Egypt chose Turkey. It didn't. Egypt chose not to be trapped. This deal only makes sense when you see it as part of a wider pattern, not a pivot. Egypt is deliberately refusing the old logic where a military ties its survival to one supplier, one block, one pipeline of approval. That model worked when wars were short and politics were stable. Neither of those conditions exists anymore. So instead of replacing one dependency with another, Egypt is doing something colder and more effective, fragmenting dependence. Different suppliers for different layers, different sources for systems, production knowledge, and raw inputs. and wherever possible, pulling the most fragile part of the chain, consumables, inside its own borders. This is not neutrality, it's insulation. In that framework, Turkey isn't a patron, it's a component, a source of experience in how to force industrial capability into existence without collapsing readiness. The same way Egypt learns from others without surrendering control to any of them. This matters because leverage only works when it's concentrated. When one supplier controls spare parts, upgrades, ammunition, and training, pressure is easy. When those elements are split, localized, and partially internalized, pressure becomes expensive and unreliable. That's the real threat this deal represents. Not military escalation, but option expansion. Egypt can now say no more easily, delay more comfortably, absorb shocks longer, and none of that requires confrontation or declarations. It happens quietly through redundancy. And redundancy is the enemy of coercion. This strategy also explains the restraint on publicity. You don't advertise insulation. You let others discover it too late. The more invisible the shift, the less resistance it attracts while it's still forming. What Egypt is doing here is future-proofing, not against a specific country or alliance, but against volatility itself, against sudden freezes, against moralized supply chains, against wars that drag on while the world loses interest. And once this logic is in place, something else happens. It stops being theoretical. Because once one country proves you can break out of dependency without isolation, others start recalculating, quietly, internally, without coordination. Not everyone will build factories, but many will seek proximity to those who do. New trade routes form, new habits develop, new defaults emerge. That's how systems erode, not through rebellion, but through irrelevance. And at that point, the deal stops being about Egypt's choices. It becomes about consequences others didn't prepare for. Which leads to the final question this story has been circling without naming. What happens when this model stops being rare and starts being normal across Africa? What happens is simple. The old leverage stops working. When this model spreads, Africa doesn't suddenly become militarized or aggressive. It becomes harder to pressure, harder to stall, harder to corner. Not because of ideology, but because the mechanics of control no longer function the way they used to. The old system relied on predictability. African states would buy, external suppliers would approve, deliveries would arrive on someone else's timeline, and when disagreements appeared, supply could be slowed without firing a single shot. Power lived in paperwork. That system collapses the moment production moves closer to the battlefield. If ammunition can be sourced regionally, sanctions lose urgency. If a spare supply exists within reach, diplomatic threats lose timing. If production is continuous, delays stop being fatal. None of this requires confrontation. It simply removes the pressure points quietly. That's why this deal wasn't framed as a revolution. Because revolutions provoke responses. Normalization doesn't. Once Egypt proves that manufacturing can exist without isolation, without collapse, without choosing sides, others will follow, not through imitation, but through necessity. Some will partner, some will co-produce, some will specialize, others will align supply routes toward whoever proves reliable. This is how ecosystems form. No declarations, no summits, no unity speeches, just behavior changing. And when behavior changes long enough, systems adapt or decay. What makes this shift dangerous to the old order is not scale, it's repeatability. Egypt doesn't need to dominate. It only needs to demonstrate that the dependency ceiling can be broken. After that, every country with industrial ambition starts asking the same question internally. Why are we still exposed like this? That question alone destabilizes control. Because once survival no longer depends on external approval, diplomacy becomes negotiation again, not leverage management. Partnerships become transactional, not hierarchical. And African states stop being treated as endpoints of supply chains and start behaving like nodes within them. That doesn't mean conflict disappears. It means conflict becomes less exploitable. And that's the part no one announces. This deal doesn't threaten anyone directly. It threatens a pattern where power was maintained by distance, delay, and dependency. A pattern where Africa's strength could be measured, predicted, and paused. That predictability is now cracking, not loudly, not symbolically, but mechanically. So this story doesn't end with Turkey. It doesn't end with Egypt. It ends with a question every African government will have to answer sooner than expected. If survival can be manufactured, why keep renting it? Let us know in the comment section. Will more nations follow up? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.